Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about osmosis, and especially osmosis as it relates to movement of water through cell membranes. Osmosis is defined as movement of a solvent, such as water, through a membrane from a region of higher solvent concentration to a region of lower solvent concentration. So basically, solvents like water like to move from where there's larger amounts of water to where there's lesser amounts of water. Basically, you can think of solvents as moving from where it's very wet to where it's relatively drier. So let's see how this works out with cell membranes, just like the Alodia plants we looked at in lab. Okay, so we've got a beaker of water here, and we've dumped one plant cell in here. This plant cell is 10% solute, so maybe it's got 10% salt or carbohydrates or proteins or lipids or something like that. Because it's 10% solute, it's 90% solvent. So 10% solute, 90% solvent, such as water. And we've dunked it in a beaker of distilled water. Remember, distilled water has no solutes at all, so it's straight water. So the water is 0% solute, 100% solvent. Okay, which of these two regions has the higher concentrations of solvent? Obviously, the distilled water. Remember, water always wants to flow from where there's higher concentrations of water to where there's lower concentrations of water. So which way is our water going to flow? It's going to flow into the cell. So water is going to flow into the cell. As water flows into the cell may swell. If it's an animal cell, it may burst. And basically, when water flows into a cell, a plant cell rather, and hydrates it and expands the cell membrane, it's called deplasmolysis. So deplasmolysis is when the plasmolysed plant cell, that is one of the plasma membranes shriveled up, rehydrates itself and looks more normal. And we have different names for different parts of, or different sides rather, of the membrane. The side of the membrane with more solvent is called the hypotonic side. So in this particular case, where's our hypotonic side? It would be outside in distilled water with 100% solvent. So outside is our hypotonic side. So distilled water is hypotonic. Inside the cell you have a higher concentration of solute. So now the inside of the cell is considered hypertonic. Remember, water always flows from where it's hypotonic to where it's hypertonic. Also, you must remember that these terms are totally relative. The same cell could be hypertonic or hypotonic depending on what's on the other side of the membrane. Let's look at our next case. Okay, this particular cell, same cell, 10% solute, 90% solvent, and we've dunked it in basically a glass of salt water. It says 20% solute, that is 20% salt, so it must have 80% solvent. So it has more solute outside the glass than inside the cell. In this case, the situation is reversed. Now water is going to flow from where it's higher in concentration, that is inside the cell, to where it's lower in concentration, that is outside the cell. Water flows outside the cell, and the cell will start to shrivel up. If it's a plant cell, basically the plasma membrane will pull away from the cell wall and form like a clear bag inside the cell. That's called plasmolysis in a plant cell. So we may have plasmolysis occur. Okay, so inside the cell is it hypertonic or hypotonic? Remember, now inside the cell we have relatively lower concentrations of solvent. So now this particular cell is hypotonic. Same cell is over here, but now it's hypotonic. And the water over here is now hypertonic. Water is flowing from where it's hypotonic to where it's hypertonic. Okay, our last case is same cell, 10% solute, 90% solvent, and now we've dunked it in water that's got a little bit of solute in it, maybe a little bit of salt. It's also 10% solute, it's also 90% solvent. In this particular case, is there going to be a particular flow of water in one direction or the other? Not really. We may have a little bit of water going in, we may have a little bit of water going out, but overall there's not going to be a net change because there's no osmotic pressure, because there's no real difference between the sides of the membrane. This particular case is called isotonics. The concentrations on both sides of the membrane are the same. It's called an isotonic cell. There's no particular direction of water flow. So remember, whether something is hypertonic or hypotonic depends on what's on the other side of the membrane, and water always flows from where it's hypotonic, that is, there's more water, to where it's hypertonic, that is, where it's less water.